Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm your guest host, Emmy Vadnais, filling in for Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is the embodied quantum mind. My guest is Dr. Thomas Verny, who is a psychiatrist who founded the Association for Pre- and Perinatal Psychology and Health and served as its president for 8 years. He is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Pre- and Perinatal Psychology and Health and is author of Inside Groups, a practical guide to encounter groups and group therapy. The Secret Life of the Unborn Child with John Kelly that has been published in 27 countries. Pre- and Perinatal Psychology, an Introduction. Parenting Your Unborn Child. Nurturing the Unborn Child with Pamela Weintraub. Gifts of Our Fathers. Heartfelt Remembrances of Fathers and Grandfathers. Tomorrow's Baby. The Art and Science of Parenting from Conception through Infancy. Pre-Parenting. Nurturing Your Child from Conception. And The Embodied Mind. Understanding the Mysteries of Cellular Memory, Consciousness, and Our Bodies, which is the topic of our conversation today. Dr. Verny is located in Stratford, Ontario in Canada, and now we'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Dr. Verny. It's such a pleasure to have you with us on New Thinking Aloud today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Much of your career has focused on the life of the unborn child and helping with parenting. How did you move from that to studying and researching and reporting on the embodied quantum mind?
It has been a kind of natural progression because when I wrote The Secret Life of the Unborn Child, it was published in 1981. So when I started writing it in 1979, 1980, at that time, there was some research that showed that children at the age of 6 months after conception, in other words, at the end of the second trimester, would be able to lay down some rudimentary memories. But also, I was getting reports from mothers and grown-up children remembering their births, being regressed back to earlier times, that some of these children, some of these people, remembered things that happened to them before that age. In other words, all the way back to conception. And so that was not supported by science. And because I have always had sort of a scientific bent of mind, that bothered me. It bothered me that there were these reports that, at least scientifically, could not be explained. And so that has always been sort of in the back of my mind. And then 7 years ago, I came across this report by a French physician about a 44-year-old man who went to see his physician because he had a weakness in his left leg. And so they did all kinds of laboratory tests. They did an X-ray of his head. And to everybody's astonishment, they found that the man had virtually no brain. He had a thin crust of cerebral tissue, and the rest was water, cerebrospinal fluid. We call it hydrocephalus in medicine. And so this man was 44 years old. He was a married man, father of 2 children, and working in the French civil service. For all intents and purposes, he was a normal person. So I thought to myself, how is this possible? This does not make sense. And I've always been kind of a logical person. I'm a chess player. I love playing chess. I'm analytic. And when something doesn't make sense, it bothers me. And so I started looking into the literature. And I found, again to my surprise, that actually there were a lot of reports, particularly of children, for example, who suffered of epilepsy and who had surgery, and sometimes they had half of their brains removed, sometimes more than half of their brains removed, and they continued to act and behave and think normally. There were also reports of adults having brain tissue removed, large parts of their brain, and acting normally. So that's when I first thought that our bodies must have some kind of a backup system, just like your computer, has a backup system in the clouds or whatever. There has to be a backup system in the body. And so that's when I started researching what I call cellular intelligence. In other words, that all the cells in our bodies, all the tissues and organs which are made up of cells, everything in the world really that lives is made up of cells, that all these cells combine together and act as a backup system to the brain. And so then it took me 7 years to write the book, The Embodied Mind. And I read something like 5,000 journals and books in preparation for it. Again, all of them, very hard scientific papers. And then I quote about 500 of them in my book. And so I put all of that knowledge together, and, I found that evolution really is a master at preserving biological bits that benefit survival, and that we are really not that different. Our human beings are not that different from lower animals, which are not that different from the simplest bacteria in the world. It's the same cells and very often the same genes which have been repurposed. So yes, it's not the same, but essentially it's the same. And so, it's what I would like to emphasize is that cognition has been a slow climb. It's not a magical leap along this evolutionary path. And so I think that science and religion combined have made this huge mistake of putting men sort of at the top of creation, and in a sense looking down upon other creatures in the world. And I really don't think we should do that. I think that we are all connected, and I think that we should respect all living creatures.
Right. As humans, we tend to think that we are the top animals.
Yes.
And in your research, you showed that consciousness, we tend to think of it up in, quote, the brain, or because we have many of our sensory systems in the head, we tend to think that it's all coming from this region of our body. But in your research, you showed that consciousness really resides in all aspects and various aspects of the body, all the way down to the cellular and the quanta level. Yes.
And, if we look at, for example, research on end of life and near-death experiences, for example, I had one. I witnessed one myself when I was a young intern at a hospital, St. Michael's Hospital here in, not here, but in Toronto, because I live outside of Toronto. And one of my patients died right there in front of me. His heart stopped beating. There was no doubt about it. He was dead. And I was taught that when that happens, you take a syringe full of adrenaline and you just plunge it into the person's heart, because they are dead. It doesn't really matter. You're not causing them any pain, or at least that's what we were taught. Well, I did that. And then I called, alarm, and nurses and doctors started coming in. In about 5 to 10 minutes, the man regained consciousness. But this is the amazing part, which I will always remember. He started to describe what happened in that room, and he described it accurately, but he described it in a way that he was seeing everything from above, like from the ceiling down, not from where he was lying, but from the ceiling down. So that was the first experience that I had personally, that in a sense, I guess, looking back up on it now, now that I'm speaking to you, I've never really thought of this before. But perhaps in a way, it put me on a trajectory towards a different view of the mind and consciousness. I've never, honestly, God, I've never thought of this before. I kind of buried it, in the back of my mind. But now that we are talking about it, it seems to me quite possible, that it sort of put the first seeds of doubt in my mind about consciousness, because like all medical doctors, I was taught that when the heart stops and the brain stops, you're dead. That's it. And yet, there is research now coming from many parts of the world, and you're probably more familiar with it because you work on this a lot more than I do. But from all parts of the world, that the mind is not totally dependent on the brain. As I put it in my book, the mind is more than the brain. I don't know what that is. I will not go as far as to say that it's A or B or C, but surely it is more than just the brain. Most scientists, most of my colleagues, believe that the mind is an epiphenomenon of the brain, meaning that it's a byproduct of the brain. Just like bile is a byproduct of the liver, or urine is a byproduct of the kidneys, so the mind is a byproduct of the brain. And nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, they're not the same at all. I mean, you really don't have to be very clever to see that is, you cannot compare urine to the mind. It's just silly. So I think that, that's where I got more involved with the quantum mind, because if you just look at Newtonian science and everything is measurable, and things which are not measurable are not important, then you cannot make sense out of the mind. You have to go beyond Newtonian science to come even close to understanding the mind.
Well, thank you for sharing that story about working with your patient who you revived and brought back essentially to life. Did that patient share with you anything about their experience? Do you recall, sometimes when people have near-death experiences, they describe that they want to sometimes stay where they are, often, frequently, and that
Yes.
They're told either that they need to come back or that they choose to come back because they want to do something here on Earth.
He did not, because it was in a hospital environment and I was an intern and I was busy looking after God knows how many people at the same time. So did not have the convenience, the luxury of talking to him again. But in terms of what you have just said, actually, I myself, again, had that experience. I was not dying, but I was doing a workshop on rebirthing. Have you ever heard of rebirthing?
Yes, I have.
So I was doing a workshop on rebirthing, and with a group of people all around me, and we were lying on the floor, and there was some music playing, and I just went out, just the way you describe it. I moved towards the light, and it was the most unimaginable bright light, but not blinding. It was very bright, but not blinding. And I just felt this incredible love coming out of it. And just like you say, I wanted to stay there forever. I didn't want to go. It was so beautiful. I could hear people around me, breathing and talking and crying and whatever. But at the same time, I was up there in the light. And then I thought that, I can't stay here forever. I have family, I have friends, I have loved ones. and I chose to come back. Yeah. So I had that experience. And again, it's one of those experiences that stays with you forever once you have had it. And it's true because you didn't make it up, like you were there, right? So, sometimes you when I talk to scientists with a very capital S, who are very, very full of their importance, they would just kind of look at you as if you were crazy if you tell them this kind of a story, right? The same thing applies to heart transplants. As I describe in my book, there are many people who have had a change of personality, which appears to be part of the personality of the donor. And when I talked to a cardiac surgeon a few months ago, I said, do you ever tell your patients before surgery, when you're doing heart transplants, that they might have a change in personality? And he said, oh, no, never. No. So, don't complicate things with facts, right?
I would love to talk about the heart, but just to go back for a moment, the rebirthing, because of your incredible background and really being a leader in the pre and perinatal, from conception all the way up to birth and beyond, can you share a little bit about what rebirthing is, that process you went through? And I think it's phenomenal that you then were literally born again, it sounds like, from your near-death experience through that process.
I suppose so. I'm certainly not in any way an expert on rebirthing. It was just a couple of workshops that I attended, but essentially they teach you to breathe in a certain way, which is very similar to the way Indian yogis breathe. And it's kind of a connected breathing. And then I suppose there is a suggestion there that you are going to regress to some important parts of your life. They don't tell you where, usually. And in a sense, the suggestion and being in a group and everybody doing the same thing creates certain expectations. And then as a result of that, you may have certain experiences, which in most cases are pretty good, not in all cases, because sometimes people can go back to, for example, an attempted abortion by your mother while you're in the womb, or perhaps mother or father saying that we don't want this child, this was a big mistake, things like that. So it's not just positive facts or events or memories that come out. It could be negative, but in my case, it was just positive, which in a sense brings us to another point, which is important, and that is the power of your thoughts. And, it's again one of the things that I write about in the Embodied Mind, because if hypnosis, for example, or self-hypnosis and suggestion, they all can be very powerful therapeutic tools, and we can do that to ourselves.
There have been research studies by people such as Masaru Emoto, even Dean Radin with Gail Hyson and others, where they've demonstrated that thoughts impact the substance, the water. In the case of Emoto with Dean Radin, he's probably worked with many different components, but the couple I'm familiar with is chocolate and tea, where intentions or thoughts are put into these substances. And could you share a little bit about what you've shown or what you found in your research with these thoughts and how they can impact all the way to the cellular level of our consciousness?
Actually, I had an interview a couple of months ago with one of the foremost supporters of Emoto in Japan, and that was very interesting. But essentially, you can take this in many different ways. We know, for example, going back to prenatal psychology, we know, for example, that things that are said after a baby is born or very early on without any thought can have long-term toxic effects if they are negative comments. When I was writing The Secret Life of the Unborn Child, I visited a neonatal intensive care unit in Toronto, and there were 36 little sort of hospital beds.
Isolates?
That's it. Isolate. Thank you. And half of them had little name tags on them, like call me Emmy or call me George or call me Joe, whatever. Half of them. The other half did not. I said to the head nurse who was taking me around, I said, why are so many of these kids nameless? And she said, because their parents don't want to get too close to them in case they die. Now, I can assure you, I would be willing to bet my house and everything that I own on the fact that the mortality and morbidity among those children without names was much higher than the ones with names, okay? Because the ones with names were receiving the energy, the loving energy from their parents, and the other ones were not. And that can be tremendously healing, right? We all know that. Once I was lecturing in Spain, and I needed to go to emergency because of an emergency that happened to me, and they were going to perform a very painful intervention, and the nurse put out her hand, and I grabbed her hand, and I tell you, I'm gonna get emotional now because it just helped so much to be able to hold on to another human being while this procedure was being carried out. Makes a huge difference. So, coming back to emotions and the feelings that we get from other people. So I had a couple of friends, and that's described also in the chapter there on the mind and the brain in my book. I had a couple of friends who put up 2 jars on their piano filled with boiled rice, and they were very close together, and so they got the same sunlight, the same temperature, everything the same. And to one of them, I'm just going to look up not to mislead you. So to the rice on the left, they daily directed their voices saying, "Thank you, you're beautiful." To the rice on the right, they said, "You fool, you stink." Within 3 months, the one on the left that got positive information was almost the same, hardly rotted at all. The other one was already half black, rotting like crazy. And that continued over the next few months. So I say to you, if boiled rice can react that way to emotionally laden, charged voices, wouldn't human beings react similarly, right? So, what we say to other people is just so important, and hardly anybody realizes that.
Yes. So what do you think is happening in that experiment?
That's a good question. That is a very good question. I think what is happening in that experiment is that on a cellular level, the cells are reacting to positive and negative energy because actually, our voices, emotions, that all carries energy. And so when you get positive energy, and we really don't know the first thing about this. I mean, I wish I could be more scientific and more specific, but obviously positive energy energizes you. It genetically, it would certainly, improve all the positive genes, all the genes that are good for you, and it would decrease the impact of the negative genes. And so it's the same thing that happens to the unborn child, within the mother, that when the mother sends positive messages, I love you, I care about you, I look forward to seeing you when you're born, messages like that, that baby is going to benefit from it. And when we talk about adults, I mean, if you speak to your children or to your friends in a positive way, you are encouraging growth and positivity in their minds and their bodies. On the other hand, hostile encounters make people sick.
In your example of when you were having a person holding your hand during a crisis in your life, my mother had a similar experience when she was dealing with her cancer, and she was going to multiple doctor appointments, meeting with the surgeon even, and so many people. She told me that one day she went in and she was waiting for the doctor to come in, and I think it was the medical assistant came in and took her vitals and asked how my mother was doing, and my mother replied, and the person held her hand, and my mother said she started crying because it was the first time that she felt that she was not being treated like a piece of meat in the healthcare system.
Exactly, yes. And it made her feel better.
It made her feel better. She said it was the first time she experienced any compassion through that entire process.
Yes, yes. So, if nothing else, I hope that your listeners listen and learn something from that, because that is such an important message.
That brings us to the heart, and how for millennia the heart has been thought to be the seat of emotions and love. And can you share, because in your research, because there's even evidence that the heart has its own nervous system and has its own really brain, if you will?
That's right. Yes. That is absolutely correct. It has its own nervous system, of course, which makes it possible, actually, for heart transplants to work. Because when you do a heart transplant, you take the old heart out, which means that all the connections are disconnected from the old heart, right? Because you cut the nerves, you cut the arteries, all of that is cut, and you put the new heart in. But there's no way you can connect the arteries to the heart, but you cannot connect the nerves to the heart. Okay, they have to grow in. So the reason that the heart is able to continue to beat in the new recipient is because it has a nervous system of its own. But equally important, and perhaps more important from our standpoint, is the fact that, like you said, the heart has its own memory neurons. There are at least 40,000 memory neurons in the heart, and the heart has the largest electromagnetic force of any organ. It's something like 1,000 times stronger than the electromagnetic force of the brain. So the heart puts out incredibly strong vibrations, and very often when two people's hearts sync, then they fall in love, or at least are attracted to each other. Their hearts are really attracted to each other. And so it's really, really not surprising that some heart transplant recipients will report on the fact that quite unconsciously, without having had any information about the donor, they begin to have likes and dislikes and personality of the donor. And so, I'm thinking of the case report of one young woman who was like totally queer by her own admission, didn't want to have anything to do with men. When she got the transfer of a heart from a man who was heterosexual. She suddenly became heterosexual and became interested in other men. And her diet totally changed. Another person could feel the impact of the motorcycle accident that the donor was involved in and complained about that without having the slightest idea that that's how he died. So all of these reports, which have been supported by evidence, all of these reports would suggest and support my theory that cells contain memories and that they can be transferred from one person to another. And the way I got involved in that particular aspect of research was through some very, very interesting experiments done on planaria by Professor Michael Levin at Tufts University. And if you ever want to interview one of the brightest guys in the United States, interview Michael Levin, Tufts University. He is amazing. I think he's the brightest person I ever met. And he does amazing research. And about 10 years ago, he did this research on planaria when he taught planaria about how to run certain mazes or where to live, things like that, and then cut them up into tiny little pieces. And what is amazing about planaria is that they can regrow their whole body just from a tiny piece of the old body. So these new planaria were regrown, and they remembered largely, 80%, 90% of what they were taught when they were whole.
There's more evidence that it's not just in the brain and that memory is cellular throughout the whole biological system.
Exactly. Yes. And this only worked when the brain was also regrown. So you need to have both the body and the brain working together. And I think, I'm often asked, well, what is the significance of this theory that you are proposing about the embodied mind? And the significance is that, for many, many centuries, we have lived in a patriarchal society. And patriarchal societies are hierarchical, and everything is from the top down. Okay? It's the head of the family, the head of the tribe, the head of government. Rich people live on top of hills, poor people live down below. It's so hierarchical. The army, of course, is a perfect example of hierarchy. Well, science has kind of absorbed that same kind of system. And so science, quite unconsciously, I think, has continued to regard the head as the most important part, the brain as the most important part, and everything below is secondary. And of course, then you have the church, which of course suspects anything along the lower chakras, right? So we mustn't talk about that. They don't exist, preferably. That's only for making children, perhaps, and that's about it. So when you have this kind of a disregard for the body, and in a sense, even assuming that the body is bad, okay? Like the brain is good, the body is bad because, you get cancer of the bowels, right? You get all kinds of sexually transmitted diseases, etc., etc. The body is bad, the brain is good. So we need to get away from that, okay? We need to have a more holistic approach to our bodies so that the brain is never disconnected from the body is not disconnected from the brain. That is the importance of my message.
Right, and it seems to be that nature versus nurture. In your research, which seems to be more dominant, or do you feel it's a blend?
I think it's a blend. I think anybody who tells you, that schizophrenia is 70% genetic and 30% environmental doesn't know what they are talking about, okay? I think you could talk about that before epigenetics. But now that we have totally discovered epigenetics. It has been proven. There's no doubt about it. We know that we are born with certain genes, and that's fine. They cannot be changed. But the expression of genes, in other words, which are active and which are asleep, is constantly changing. Okay, and so we have these little switches on our genome, and the switches are guided by the environment. So whether you will develop schizophrenia or not, even if you have the genes for it, doesn't really matter. What matters is whether the switches for those particular genes are switched on or off. And that's why the environment is so important. I mean, everybody knows that nature, for example, is better than living in the core of a city where you're breathing in, all the fumes and all the toxins and all the noise. All of those things are really very anti-health, as you well know, I'm sure. It's really not nature versus nurture. It is a combination of the two, and because of that, we have the power. And we should use it to influence our health.
Absolutely. Can you share what epigenetics is for those who are listening where that might be a new term for them?
Epigenetics refers to the part of genetics that has to do with how our genes respond to the environment. And we have many fewer genes than it was supposed a long time ago. We have no more than 20 to 26,000 genes. At one time, we were thought to have like many more, like 50,000, 60,000 genes. No, it's down to about 24 to 26, and half of them are really control the brain and the development of the brain. But our genome, which contains the genes, but it also contains a lot of other proteins. And what it contains are these methyl groups, what's called methyl groups. I don't have a better name for it. Methyl groups and acetyl groups, okay? And those are the switches. And the methyl group turns genes off, and the acetyl groups turn them on. And so what we are learning in epigenetics is what kinds of environmental factors will turn genes on and off. So it's not a question of changing the genes. We cannot change them, perhaps over evolution of thousands and thousands of years. Some of the genes get changed. But essentially what we can change is whether they're activated, fully activated, partially activated, or whether they're just going to sleep and be deactivated. So that's why epigenetics is so important. So when a child, for example, is born, and whether, for example, it is born by cesarean section or born naturally, it will make a difference in terms of epigenetics, because when the baby is born by cesarean section, it's going to pick up a lot of bacteria which are on the mother's abdomen, even though she's sanitized and all that. But they will be still picking up bacteria from the environment, which then is going to affect their expression of genes. Whereas if they are born vaginally, they are going to pick up lactobacilli from the vagina, which is very good because it will help them to absorb the mother's milk. So all of these things will be very, very important epigenetically speaking. And so I guess just the simplest way is to say epigenetics is about the influence of the environment on your genes. And that's something that you can actually control to some extent.
You're saying that we are born with a certain type or set of genes that we've inherited, and that the epigenetics is our environment, as you just described.
Yes.
The physical environment, but also maybe the emotional or psychological environment externally from our parents and teachers and family, extended family, but also our internal environment and maybe even our own self-talk.
Let me give you a very quick study on that. It was done in New York. 84 hotel maids were being studied by a psychologist from Harvard University, and half of them they were divided into two groups, and half of them were told that the daily work that they did lived up to the definition of physical exercise by the whoever is in charge of health in the United States. And the other half were not told that. After 1 month, the health of both groups was measured. The women who were told that their daily work was really exercise, was really good physical exercise, their blood pressure dropped, their weight dropped, all kinds of indices of health improved. They did not work any differently. They just believed that what they did was good for them. So that belief changed the genes, which then changed the blood pressure and all those other things. So we can constantly do that. And so, again, it's one of the things that listeners really need to take to heart, because if you think positively, and I don't mean in a kind of a, unreal way, but, based on good information, if you think positively, today I've exercised, I've been out in nature, this is good for me. If you can sort of absorb that and really feel it in your cellular consciousness, it's going to be good for you.
Yeah.
And that changes your genes. Like all those thoughts change the expression of your genes. So that's where epigenetics comes in.
And can you share a little bit about body armoring and how our thoughts, our suppressed thoughts, can impact us and what we can do about that to live better, healthier lives?
We keep a lot of trauma in our bodies, hidden away in cells, and there are many different ways in which those things can be perhaps brought out in a therapeutic way. Certainly, body work in terms of massage, deep tissue massage, all kinds of other ways of doing that. The first step would be to realize that you have that. The first step would be to realize that you are armored in some way, perhaps because of your posture, or perhaps because you have always pain in certain part of the body, or you can't feel anything in a certain part of the body. So becoming aware, I think, is the first step. And then there are many different ways that one can resolve those issues. It can be through talk therapy, or it can be through body work, and through rebirthing. I mean, there are many different ways. One of the things I think that we need to remember is that not one way does not work for everybody. Okay? You mentioned guided imagery, for example, at the beginning. Guided imagery worked very well for me. Hypnosis did not work for me at all in terms of, gaining more insight into my unconscious. You have to find out what works for you. Two things about that. If you want to gain insight, if you want to somehow improve your mental health, you may need to see different therapists or different approaches. And the one thing that we really need to watch out for is, that many therapists only have one hammer. And so every problem becomes a nail. And you don't want to be a nail. So, if you go to a psychoanalyst, for example, he or she will treat you with psychoanalysis, and that may be totally wrong for you, or even totally wrong for the problem that you have. So just be aware of the fact that you have to be selective and sometimes experiment, and may have to go and see 2 or 3 different people until you find the person with whom you are on the same wavelength.
Yeah, good point that everybody is literally different and unique on what will help them with what they're dealing with. And in your research, you also showed that the gut microbiome can impact mental health.
Yes, very important. Another very, very important. There are so many drugs, for example, which work or do not work because of the microbiome. Okay, for example, statins. Just I don't know. A couple of weeks ago, I was just reading a report on statins. Statins, are being used by millions of Americans and other people all over the world in order to decrease their cholesterol. But they don't work on some people. And so research has been done, and it shows that some people have bacteria in their gastrointestinal tract which destroy statins. And so for those people, statins don't work. There's nothing wrong with the statins. It's their microbiome.
Well, Dr. Thomas Verny, this has been a very enlightening and educational conversation. I know there's so much more that we could talk about. You put together so much great information in your book. Are there any last thoughts or comments you would like to share about the embodied quantum mind?
No, thank you very much for a lovely, lovely interview. And no, I think that we touched on some of the major points.
Thank you so much for being with me today.
You're welcome.
And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us.